Okay, welcome everybody. We are so delighted that you've joined us for our second Talking Writing event presented via Zoom. My name is Sarah. I'm the Projects and Communications Officer at Writing New South Wales. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm currently streaming from lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We'd also like to extend our acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of all the peoples on whose lands that you're streaming from. I think it's really important at this moment in time that we acknowledge and honour the context in which all thought and learning occurs in this country, the knowledge, learnings and storytelling traditions of First Nation peoples, as well as recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. So this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Since we're coming together online from many parts of the country, if you want to share your own acknowledgement or let us know whose land you're on, add it to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'd really love to hear it. This event is part of our ongoing Talking Writing series that we hold across the year. Each event provides a space for writers to share their work and discuss Australian arts and literature in which faith, race, culture, gender and sexuality intersect. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment during the event, we'd really love it if you do. We really love the sort of community spirit that while we're all apart, we can still chat and talk and you know, discuss big ideas. So we'd love it if you participated via the chat box. We'll be taking any questions that you have, and Deborah will ask them at the end of this event when we have a Q&A session. So please feel welcome to chat to your fellow attendees, ask any questions, make any comments in the chat box. We'd just love to hear everything. You'll notice that you're muted. You will be throughout the whole event. This is just to ensure the best possible sound quality. Let us know also via the chat if you have any problems hearing any of the speakers or having any technical issues. We'll do our best to try and help you out, but it's quite a large crowd tonight. So the best advice we can give you is if it's not working, log out and try and log in again and we'll let you in. To see our speakers, toggle the screen to speaker view at the top right-hand corner of Zoom. To see all the attendees, toggle your view to gallery view. We recommend you stay on speaker view so you can see everyone in the panel while they're speaking. At the end of the event, we will briefly unmute the audience members so you can show some love to the panelists. So maybe that's when we sort of put it all on gallery view and we can see everybody here tonight, which would be really lovely. We're also recording this event, so if you drop out or if you have to leave early, we'll be putting it up on our website in the next couple of weeks so that you can catch up then, or if you want to relive it. I will now introduce you to the panel chair of Talking Writing Food, that's Debra Adelaide. Deborah is the author and editor of 17 books, including novels, short stories, essays and academic publications. Her novel, The Household Guide to Dying, was published around the world and short or long listed for several awards, including the former Orange Prize. Her most recent publications are a collection of short stories called Zebra, which won the Steel Rudd Award in the Queensland Literary Awards, and The Innocent Reader, Essays on Reading and Writing. She's also Associate Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, where she teaches creative writing in the postgraduate program. So welcome, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and it's great to be here tonight. Welcome, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge country. I'm currently living and working on Bidjigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just before we proceed, this isn't exactly on topic, but I can't let an event like this go by without acknowledging the announcement of the Miles Franklin Award, which happened this afternoon. And for those of you who don't know, Ellen's already clapping. It went to Tara June Winch for her amazing novel, The Yield. I was really excited to see this. It is quite simply an astonishing novel. It does really bold and genuinely new things with the novel form and with Indigenous language. And I congratulate Tara June Winch and urge any of you who've not read it yet to rush out and buy it. So it's a great pleasure to welcome our three panellists for tonight's event. We have Ellen van Neerven, who is an award-winning author of 3 books. Ellen's mother's family is Mananjali from southeast Queensland, while their paternal family is Dutch, and they are based in Queensland. Their first book, Heat and Light, was published in 2014 by UQP after winning the prestigious David Unipen Award. It also won 2015 Dobby Award in the Nita B. Kibble Awards and the Indigenous Writers Prize in the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Ellen's second book is a collection of poetry, Comfort Food, first published in 2016 and reprinted several times actually, wonderful. While their third book, Throat, also a collection of poetry, won the Quentin Bryce Award just this year. Welcome, Ellen. Our next panellist is Richard Cornish, who's also an award-winning writer. He's well known as an independent writer and commentator on food issues, and also as a creative director and events host, for example, for the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. Richard is a regular contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age's Good Food sections, in which he writes a very popular and quirky brain food column. He's also written 4 books on Spanish cuisine with chef Frank Camorra. His other books include My Year Without Meat, Philippa's Home Baking, which he co-authored, and Brain Food. And most intriguingly, he's also been a commentator on the 7 Network series Iron Chef Australia. Welcome, Richard.
Sorry.
And we have as our third author tonight, Donna Lee Bryant. Donna is Professor of Creative Industries at Central Queensland University, and she's the author of several books on a variety of topics, from nursing to the creative doctorate in the humanities and to creative life writing. Donna has written on food writers and on food itself, including most recently articles in The Conversation on pickling at home and on porridge, of all things. Her most recent books include Paradoxes in Nurses' Identity, Culture and Image, The Doctoral Experience, and Publishing and Culture. Last 2 books both came out just last year. Now, just to kick off the event and to set the mood for the evening, I've asked all our panellists to start with a short reading from their work. So, as I've just mentioned pickling, Donna, shall we start with you?
Yes, and thank you. And it's lovely to see so many people here from everywhere. I've seen they're joining from Sweden, USA, all around Australia. It's very exciting. So this is a little piece, a short piece, which was published in The Conversation in a series called Great Time to Try. And the idea was that everyone was at home and we might have had a little bit more time to try different things. And I did write also about how to cook porridge. But this one is called pickling. Pickling foods in vinegar or fermenting them in brine is one of the oldest food preservation methods. The earliest archaeological evidence for pickling comes from ancient Mesopotamia and the Tigris River Valley more than 4,000 years ago. Pre-refrigeration, pickling allowed vegetables and fruits to be eaten long after they were in season, and meat such as salt pork to be carried on long journeys. Pickling soon spread around the world. Pickles are mentioned by Aristotle, in the Bible and in Shakespeare's plays. Cleopatra and Queen Elizabeth I were prominent proponents of the health properties of pickles. The wide adoption of electrical refrigeration in the 20th century meant that pickling was no longer necessary for preserving food, but by then we had appreciated pickles for their taste, and so the method has lasted. The 1893 edition of Mrs. Beeton's Everyday Cookery and Housekeeping book has a number of inspiring and very achievable recipes, ranging from gherkins and herrings to using nasturtiums as an alternative to capers. Mrs. Beeton also includes a warning against purchasing what she calls inferior, commercially produced pickles, as copper sulfate was widely used to give a vivid but unfortunately quite toxic colour. Anxiety over food adulteration reached dizzying heights in the Victorian age, with dangerous and even quite poisonous substance added to such foods to enhance their colour and flavour or eke out more expensive ingredients. The Country Women's Association Cookery Book from 1936 compiles a series of tried and true members' recipes, with a pickled beetroot recipe very cleverly using a thin layer of melted lamb fat to form an airtight seal on the cool jar. Now, such vacuum sealing was essential for unrefrigerated storage. In New Zealand, the 1968 edition of the Aunt Daisy cookbook contains an entire chapter on pickles and chutney and includes pickled figs, peaches and pears, which are rather to our more savoury taste today. And one delicious recipe suggests steeping blackberries in sugar overnight, boiling them in vinegar, then spicing with ground ginger and allspice. Reflecting Australians' increasing interest in other cuisines, the Margaret Fulton's Encyclopedia of Food and Cookery from 1983 used a number of Asian flavours in her pickles, such as her curried aubergine pickle with fresh ginger and chilli. Fulton was also aware of how pickling can turn waste destined for the green bin or compost into a crunchy condiment, as in her recipe for pickled watermelon rind. And I then finished with a couple of recipes for a quick cucumber pickle and a cauliflower pickle.
Thank you very much, Donna. And we might indeed come back to the topic of pickling in lockdown pandemic times and see how many participants have been madly pickling. We're going to come to you next, Ellen, and I think you might be going to read us some poetry.
I am, yes. I'm going to read a poem. Firstly, I'd like to say, Deborah, I love your backdrop. I think, have you got a special backdrop with the books that you're presenting for us today? Did you do that, or is it always like that? We've got French pastry.
I did carefully curate the background with some of my favourite cookbooks, including Mrs. Beeton.
It's gorgeous, gorgeous. And I do want to acknowledge country. It's been beautiful to see everyone's acknowledgements. I'm actually on the lands of the Quandamooka people on Manduraba, North Stradbroke Island, a little bit away from my usual place of residence, which is on Turrbal country, north of Brisbane. So being in Manduraba, being in one of the most eastern points of Australia at the moment, and I'm really grateful to the elders to allow me to be on this country and to have a little retreat, which is what I'm doing. And so I, as someone who's a mixed race, I'm Yugambeh, Malanjali Yugambeh on my mum's side, and my father's Dutch, and I grew up very close to Yugambeh country. My people call country Dargan, and we're connected. Yugambeh people are connected to the plants, the animals, the mountains, the valleys, the sea, the rivers. Everything is very interconnected. So when I introduce myself, I also have to introduce the country where I'm from on my maternal side. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote. It's a pandemic poem because I wrote it in March this year, anticipating where Australia was anticipating the first wave of the pandemic. Now we have, in the southern states of Victoria and even perhaps New South Wales, we're entering in the second wave I do think that this poem still really remains relevant to this particular time that we are in. So this poem's called Social Isolation is an Act of Love. We scroll the news, trying to figure out what's to come, looking at measures placed on other countries. School closures, city lockdowns, individual freedoms we give up. Where will we be a day from now, a week, a month, 6 months from now? Projections made onto bodies, hearts in mouths. We worry ourselves sick. Looking outside ourselves, time to look within, go inside. We scrutinize the house, what's not on our shelves, counting what we have left. With fresh eyes, we see shelter in place. It's time to make a home. Clean and mend what we have. Make warm and special. It's the only place we've got. Rearrange the spice rack, tea cupboard, sock drawer. Maybe find something we thought we lost, retrieved from a locked place. Pick up that book, finish that puzzle, rekindle an old thought. Bake a cake, pick up a paintbrush, pencil, or needle. Rewire the self. Host freshly picked flowers, light a candle, put on a favorite record. It's okay to grieve. 2020 is not what we expected. Ring friends and kin living alone. Check in with our voice. No mass gatherings at funerals. We send digital messages to the bereaved. The absence of ceremony hurts. The dog needs to be walked. We shuffle outside. There's no one about. Butterflies surround us. The world shuts down borders. The birds carry on as usual. The world is a physical place. Social distancing is hard. The virus is a living thing. It weaves separation. Dr. Suan says to isolate is not an act of fear. It's an act of love. How will we be in lockdown? Will we sing like the Italians, cheer for frontline workers like the Spanish, love our elders, nurture effective relations, share our past stuff?
Ellen, thank you so much for sharing that poem with us, which is absolutely captivating and touching, and somehow you captured the entire experience of being in lockdown with great clarity. Thank you so much.
You.
So we're going to move on to Richard now. I think you have a lovely piece you're going to read from about nuns.
And greetings from Boonwurrung Country in Melbourne, a beautiful place. And I come from and Ellen, sorry, Ellen, that is beautiful. Thank you so much. There's a line in there. Was it something about grieving about
2020.
What was it? What was the line again?
It's okay to grieve. 2020 is not what we expected.
And what was the line about not being able
to attend funerals and just having to send digital messages to the bereaved? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that was beautiful. That all of a sudden I was struck with like Deb Cheatham's Humarella. That was powerful. Thank you. Hello, good evening, everyone. I come from a single-parent household. I grew up on a farm where mum did everything, and so I always looked to women, but for guidance. But also, you know, we're talking. I'm coming from Boonwurrung Country here. What I'm noticing about food is that food is giving us a sense of place and a sense of meaning. And I'm going to read you something that comes from a trip I did with Frank Camorra in Spain. And it gives you a sense that food is a lot more than about consumption. It's actually about a sense of meaning. And so we're traveling around the south of Spain. Myself, Frank Camora, a photographer called Alan Benson, and a wonderful chap, our fixer, and a very good friend of ours called Cesc Castro. We try to find nuns who are going to give us a story about their beautiful pastries. And we're trying to find them in all these convents, these 12th century convents around the south of Spain. Eventually catch up with some through lots of different means. And I'll read you this little, when we catch up with them, we find them and they tell us their story. 3 nuns are sitting on chairs behind a heavy iron grill. They quietly finger their rosaries as they introduce themselves. Maria Jose, Clara, and Teresa are the Clarissas de la Casa Sourdough. Many of Andalusia's best pastries are made by nuns. We have visited many convents, hoping to learn why their pastries taste better than those from pastry shops. But so far, our efforts had been proved fruitless. When I posed the question to them, they pause for a moment, then quietly discuss it amongst themselves. Overcoming an initial reluctance and slight awkwardness in conversation, something we put down to their practice of living and working in silence, Sister Maria Jose insists that the recipes the sisters use are no different to those used by others. Quote, they came with the girls from their mother's kitchens when they entered the convent, Sister Teresa adds. The best ingredients are like law to us. The olive oil must be the best extra virgin. Then it is then Sister Clara's turn to speak. We work in silence. We are not here to make sweets. We're here to work with God. At this, Teresa becomes quite gregarious and animated. When we are mixing the ingredients and rolling the pastries, we are at one with God. Our job is to love God and to love his people. The pastries we make are so good because we make them with love for God. The nuns go on to describe how they make their sweet treats without actually passing on the recipe. And with that, we take our leave, somehow purchasing far more biscuits and pastries than is humanly possible to eat in a week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thanks everyone for those readings. I could just sit here and listen to you all read for the rest of the night, actually, but we'd better move on. We will get back to the actual writing shortly, but just for the moment, I wonder if we can discuss some of the broader and contemporary context of writing about food at this time, and indeed drill down a little bit into the role of food in a time of lockdown and in a pandemic. So Richard, do you have a sourdough starter story? Have you got on the sourdough juggernaut like everyone else? I know you actually wrote about a 100-year-old sourdough mother kept by a German family in the Barossa, I think.
Sourdough is a living thing, and yes, I did track down a 100-year-old sourdough that had been made by a family in the Barossa Valley, and the woman who made it was making it to her husband's family's recipe, and it had been passed down to her, and it's a matrilineal thing, and so it comes down through the female line. She wasn't sure whether she was going to keep it up because it involved boiling potatoes, hops, and flour to make the starter, to which the mother was added, and to her she made it, I think, defying her actual lack of love of cooking, and she made it to prove her love for her family, but also to just simply because it was such a strong tradition. It was made in a crock, in a crock that came from Germany, and it was covered with a plate that was a child's plate that came from Germany in about 1870, and it was an enamel plate, and it had German figures on the plate denoting the time of day. And so they were the artifacts that came from Silesia in Germany. And for her, it was simply an act of of creation and recreation, continually renewing the life of the sourdough, because sourdough is a living thing. It has lactobacillus, it has acetobacter, it has wild yeasts, and all these other different organisms that continue, that is a continuum of history and a continuum of flavour, but also a continuum of culture. And when you look at the word culture, it is actually in that pot is culture. It is pure culture. All those bugs are culture. And to me, that really defines a lot about food and cooking as culture, is that it is this an amazing continuum that takes us back to the past. And hopefully, if we are simply the conduits that take recipes from the past and push them to the future with us.
Yeah, and that connects to what you said right at the start before you read your piece about food being so much more about what we put in our mouths.
It's got nothing to do with it's got a lot to do with what we put in our mouths. But I think the reason a lot of us write about food is because it's the Trojan horse that gets us into a lot of other conversations. You can be sitting with a taxi driver from anywhere around the world, and the conversation will start about what's your favorite food. And the conversation will then lead to family, friends, history, politics, etc. And so to me, it's all about story. Food is about story.
I think that might be the quote for the night, but we'll come back to that. Ellen, you mentioned at the end of your poem, pasta, making pasta. So in lockdown, have you been madly baking banana bread or anything like that? Doing anything particular with
I don't think I've really done much different, actually. Yeah, I think my cooking and eating habits have been the same, except the missing of the large gatherings, which is really, that's the absence for me and the difference of these times.
Yeah, I think most of us can connect with that. Donna, I assume during lockdown you've been pickling. Do you want to comment on that?
It's very scary to write recipes for publication. That's my comment on that. Like, I'm a cook who I read a lot of cookbooks and I read a lot of recipes, and except if it's baking, then I just riff on it. But when you're writing recipes for other people to supposedly follow or try, and especially like pickling that you could actually poison yourself with, it's quite terrifying. So there was lots and lots and lots for a little, I think, 800-word article. There was a lot of testing and saying, oh no, you can't put that much salt in it, everyone will die, even though that's how much salt we put in it. And it is just interesting thinking of what you eat yourself and how you cook it, and then also putting that out for public consumption. And the porridge article, we ate porridge until we could eat no more porridge, although that wore off. We love porridge.
But as you say, you do have a responsibility not to poison your readers or lead them astray. So
it was fascinating, in the conversation they have the little comments boxes, and the pickling went down fine. But the porridge, you would not believe, everyone has their way or the highway when it comes to porridge. And that was probably the most contentious thing I've ever written.
How interesting.
Fascinatingly, how interesting.
For something that's basically 2 ingredients, oats and water.
Oh, well, you've touched on the great salt debate there.
Oh, well,
Deborah.
let's not go down that road any further, because all these activities we've been talking about are linked by the very fundamental human instinct for survival and preservation.
Can I just add on that to Donna's comment about porridge, Deborah, is that We think of porridge as being a daily thing that we make in the morning. But if you look back at where my people come from, it was actually made. You make a pot of porridge, and then you would spread it out. You make a big pot, and then spread it out across a drawer, and the porridge would be dried in a drawer by the fire. I don't think they're talking about the north of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And then it would be cut into cakes, and those cakes would be, you know, about that big. You'd take them to the field and eat them. They'd be quite hard, or you could then reconstitute them in water. And anyone who's been in the army would know about the 1 day ration pack. Which you get a biscuit that's really, really hardtack biscuit, which was actually taken to sea. And that would be then put into water, reconstituted, and you add to it some meat or something like, or some vegetables, green perhaps, and then that would become the meal for the day. So porridge, we think, is simply be something that you eat in the morning, but it's actually something that is then becomes preserved by drying, and then becomes a staple that you can take to the field, out to sea, etc.
Fascinating. And I'm dying to know why a drawer. Why was it poured into a drawer?
It's flat, it's by the fire, it's flat, it's by the fire, so you get the warmth from the fire. If you're in a cold climate, it would then dry out. And so you've got a porridge drawer. And I think some of the people joining us tonight might come from that culture. It died out around about the Second World War, when a lot of where my people come from the British Isles, a lot of our food culture died out then when we moved across from about 1918 to 1945 into industrial food.
The porridge drawer, in my mind, is boggling. Ellen, your poetry collection, Comfort Food, presciently entitled, one might say, draws a lot of its inspiration, obviously, from food. And many of the poems are quite short, and they do pack a real punch, like the title poem itself, for example, which brilliantly connects the eating of nachos to a moment of quite deep and painful nostalgia for home. And another poem in the collection, which is actually one of my favourites, Finger Limes, is a very beautiful and moving poem about loss and loneliness. So can you tell us a little bit about this book and how the idea of using food as the unifying theme came to you?
Yeah, as Richard said, food is story. Really, the theme, the overarching theme of comfort food was really a vehicle to talk about a lot of other things, family belonging, country, travel, connections, politics, history. But I was really, for me, writing a book, that book came out in 2016. And it was about 3 years of writing where everything was going towards this one kind of obsession, which was writing about food, but not really about food, about all the other things about it. But then as soon as I had that idea that I was going to write that book, suddenly every meal that I had was an opportunity to potentially get inspiration for writing a poem. So as you say, I write, the beautiful cover, which is designed by Josh Durham, uses the bunya nut as the kind of, yeah.
If anyone wants,
yeah, can you hold it up a little bit? Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's sort of like I'm guessing the colors are deliberate as well to sort of be the kind of reminiscent of the Aboriginal flag. So you have the bunya nut, which is, for those of you who don't know, is very significant in Southeast Queensland, where I'm from, where there was a bunya nut ceremony that was held in the Bunya Mountains every year that was almost kind of like a climate conference, in where groups would gather, and they would come for, you know, several hours away, my group being one of them, to talk about what was going on with country, what was going on, to maybe to trade. I call it a conference because that's essentially what it was. And so, you know, I've got the bunya nut, I've got finger lime, I've got some food from my country, but I'm also just talking about, you know, because I live in a modern world, I'm eating, you know, I'm eating very, you know, across cultures, if you like. You know, there's a poem about me eating chips in a pub that's full of the kind of people that you are kind of saying things about Aboriginal people, and I'm eavesdropping, and so I go in the pub bathroom and write this angry poem called Chips, about this conversation that I've eavesdropped on. So it's a way for me to explore many different things. And my book that's just come out is called Throat. So obviously I do have an obsession with with something, with, I don't even know, with digestion, let's say. Who knows what my next book's going to be called, but you know, this throat in a way is talking about other things around expression and around language. So it's all very much connected, and I think writing about food is a very political space as well.
Ellen, to me, I don't think there's one more important conversation that can be had in Australia at present, is about Indigenous rights. And to me, the amazing work that's been done by writers, and like people like Bruce Pascoe with Dark Emu, is the Trojan horse that gets people to start talking about Indigenous rights, about where we started, the land has never been ceded.
Very true, Richard. I think, so just to bounce on that, I think initially in the 90s, food was a way for your average white Australian to talk about multiculturalism. It was sort of like kind of a way to get it. But native food, indigenous food science and practices has long been faceless. You know, it's long, these technologies have been stolen. And so when we talk about appropriation, we're talking about a larger theft. But it's only very recently now with Uncle Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, which the popularity of that book, that we're starting to have those conversations and centre Indigenous food knowledge. And, you know, it's absolutely vital now for climate crisis that we think about all of these things and think about the sustainability of country.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Richard, because I did want to talk about this.
I mean, Pascoe's book talks about bread making, you know, like thousands of years before European bread making. So yeah, it does also point to what's universal, you know, food being universal as well. Yeah,
and I agree that this is the most important conversation that we need to be having in Australia. And it's a conversation that's going to go on for a long time. It's a complex conversation.
Deborah, can I just bring up one of the things I love about food writing is that I do get to be also activist as well. Max Allen and myself were able to bring the eel story from the Gundjamara people from Budgebim. Budgebim is a mountain. It's a volcanic mountain about 300 kilometres west of Melbourne. That exploded about, let's say about 8,000 years ago, and it created this amazing lava flow. In that lava flow, the Gundjamara people had their an amazing aquaculture system in which they grew and fattened eels in the volcanic ponds that were created, but also they grew turtle mussel, swan egg, reeds, etc., etc. So it's this amazing aquaculture system. That story has been told on and on and on for 7,000 years, and they've been recognised by UNESCO. And but being a food writer, we were able to bring that story of that to Melbourne, and then we had a dinner. We had eel. We had the wines that are grown on Gunditjmara country. And the Gunditjmara people were the first people to see vines planted in Victoria when Henty came to Victoria in the 1830s. And they saw the first vines planted before Melbourne was established. And so we, Marshall Langton came along. We had some of the, some of the best people in Australia were at this event, and it was a meeting place where we could talk about food and culture together around the table, and which Damien Bell from the Gunditjmara people was able to tell his story. And that's what, one of the joys and the pleasures, but also the responsibilities of being a food writer, is that you do get to tell these stories. And I just took up your time, Deborah, to tell that story again.
That's okay. This night isn't about me. What I just wanted to say, though, was thanks to the amazing work of people like Bruce Pascoe, we are so much better informed about Indigenous food and culture and history. But sadly, I think it's something like 1% of Indigenous food businesses are owned and controlled by Indigenous people. So, and Bruce Pascoe himself has his amazing Black Duck native food business, but I think it's a salutary reminder that we're just starting the conversation and there's an awful long way to go.
Let's keep talking.
We will keep talking. If I can just come back to the writing. Donna, you've written all sorts of different things, academic works, popular, what you might call popular writing. What do you prefer to write about? Do you enjoy writing about food?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, as an academic, there's things that you sort of have to write, and you do write. But I agree with the conversation we've been having that food can be so revealing of so many different things. And probably where my interest came from was women's history and domestic history, and how do you talk about women's labour and what women did and what happened in the home if you didn't talk about cooking and eating. And that food writing, many of whom in the past were women in newspapers and magazines, and those recipes could actually give us this window into past lives that weren't just, the men in politics or, the grand figures of art and culture, but were these windows into real life. And that's why I love it. And even the most simple, you'd say a simple little article in a newspaper can include all this rich history, but in a very light way that then starts people having these conversations. And I think it is time that Indigenous foods and Indigenous writers are included in that conversation.
You make a really, really interesting point about women's culture, women's history, and women's stories. People had to fight for food writing or writing about food to be taken seriously. You think? Oh,
definitely. And I mean, no offense to the panelists, but I always said that, when food writing became the thing, then, men jumped onto the bandwagon, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. But so many of the women writers of Australia who were our best-selling writers were food writers, like Margaret Fulton, sold millions of copies of her book, changed people's lives, changed how people thought about women's lives. And yet, until relatively recently, and definitely late in her career, was that writing even seen as writing. Many past writing wasn't even collected. It was just seen, if it was in a magazine, was just seen as ephemeral. But I think luckily, you know, from maybe the 70s, but definitely the 80s onwards, that changed. And we now take food writing, you know, seriously, and take those writers seriously. But that definitely, there's a fascinating fact from women writers of the past that often food writers would write under a name. There was an Anne Maxwell who wrote in many magazines in the 1950s and 60s. And under that name were a horde of women, including Margaret Fulton and many other writers of the time, who we don't even know who was writing unless we can dig down and find that in some other means.
Donna,
and I mean, I think that's...
Sorry, Donna, I was going to
Yes.
punch in there. Do you reckon that that food writing and actually the documentation of the culinary art is a feminist issue? Because I just look going back to what we're talking about with Ellen, is that Dark Emu actually documents a lot of work of what the Indigenous women were doing on the Council of the First Explorers. What do you reckon? Is food writing a feminist issue?
I think it can be. It doesn't have to be. People don't have to take that tack, but I think it definitely is a way into understanding what women still predominantly do. Most domestic labour in the home in the Western world is still performed by women. I think there's still it's still a window into that, but definitely into the past. But I don't think it has to be. I think people can come at it from, I mean, the environmental side is very important too. And one of my interests has been looking back through these past food writers. You know, we think we're very, you know, focused on not having waste and recycling and having home gardens, etc. But if you look back to the 50s and 60s, this was exactly what a lot of women Australian food writers were writing about. And I must say, I love food writing, but I love dogs more. So I'm very happy to see dogs are my favourite, absolute favourite thing.
Well, don't get me started on dog writing.
That's our next panel.
Ellen, if I can just come back to you, just because there's a lot of food and meals mentioned in your poems in Comfort Food, I'm not assuming that that means you're necessarily a foodie. But I'm just wondering, do you like reading about food? And are there particular kinds of food writing that you like to read? Do you like to read recipe books, for instance? Ellen, have we lost you?
I muted myself because I was moving around. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My current favourite food writing is the Cooking in Quarantine column on the Al Jazeera website, which is always a recipe attached to a story, and there's some really beautiful stories on there. I have a lot of cookbooks, but I have been moving around a lot, so I haven't actually taken them out of the box. But that's something that I want to return to, those cookbooks that I've been holding on to for a long time. So you've inspired me in that one.
Have you got a
because I don't think that the kind of there's nothing the same as having a cookbook. Do I have a favorite? No, I wouldn't. I just think favorites are too hard. Yeah.
Well, with the next question I'm going to ask you all, I'm thinking of the great writer and editor E.B. White, who read and wrote many thousands, tens of thousands of words about domestic chickens of all things. And he famously said he could never imagine running out of things to say about that rather specialist topic. So, Richard, I'm just going to ask you this question. Your food and culinary experiences are totally intertwined, obviously, and have been for a long, long time. Do you think you'll ever get bored with writing about food, or will you ever run out of things to say?
No, as long as people till the soil, as long as people, sorry, I'll take that back a second. As long as people look after the soil, as long as people grow things, as long as people cook things, there's always a story. One of my favourite and tragic stories is about the last the intifada in the early 20th century of Israel into Palestine, and that affected the Muneh, which is the Lebanese harvest season. And the Lebanese are terrified they're going to lose this multi-millennial old history of preserving things of things of the land. They even made they'd even get the wheat and they'd wash it out to make gluten, and they put the gluten in oil, and that was their cheese. They'd make this gluten into cheese, and because there was this war going on, they were feared that they would lose that culture, because food and culture are dynamic and it's always changing. We are losing so much of our food culture. It terrifies me. And there's so much to document this. And like, just here we are losing stuff. Here, I live in Bunurong country. The land I'm sitting on is actually an old blackfish hunting site where people would hunt for blackfish. It's not connected to the sea, so there were no eel here, but there were blackfish here on the swamp that my house is now on, and there are lakes around here. So to me, food is constantly giving you information about environment, politics, history, society. No, I will never get bored, because food tells you about what's going on. It's a litmus. It is a sign of the times. Food is culture.
Yeah, just speaking on that, I think I was really disturbed, that the towers that were locked down in Melbourne, the 9 towers, you could just, I think kind of a litmus test on how those people were treated in the towers was the food that they were given, which was just shocking, out-of-date food, sausage rolls for, a Muslim or a population that doesn't eat pork, it was just horrible. And the fact that the policing of food, so people donating food, but it not being able to get to those communities, really just was that if we're talking about food as a metaphor, that was a metaphor of the horror of that situation.
A complete misunderstanding and a complete. And that story told me, Ellen, why we need to invest in the people who are now coming to Australia. So we as Australians and the people who are coming into Australia, we need to have a constant dialogue as to what's going on, so we understand each other, so we have a constant dialogue. Food can be that first port of call. Why the heck would you send that sort of food into those places? And why don't you even ask them, okay, what do you eat? What would you like to eat? We're going to look you up. What would you like to eat? Simple. It's what we do as humans.
It's certainly symbolic of the paternalism of Australian institutions.
No, not just paternalism, just straight at ignorance and racism. Let's call it for what it is.
Well, many other things too, yeah.
There was a lot of kindness shown, though. I thought it was really interesting how, on one side there was that policing and ignorance, and on the other side there was a real positive human community connection of people saying, well, this isn't good enough, and here's this food that we're trying to send in. And it was more sympathetic, and it was more empathic, and it was more understanding. So, I mean, I think if there was, you know, a little light in that very dark story, it was that, you know, there are people that do understand and did empathise and did want to help as well in the community.
But Donna, that came from the community and not from the government, and that's where.
Yeah, exactly.
Institutional racism. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, we are so far behind in where we should be in our communication in Australia with where we are. This dreadful virus has been an enzyme that's just forged apart the veneer of society, but also of community. So we actually need to have government actually listening to community, because community is telling government what to do.
What to do. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. 100% agree. Yeah.
Good luck with that, with us getting that to happen. Governments to listen to communities.
There are ways of doing it, and there are ways of doing it. Keep on talking. Keep on talking. Keep on talking to people who are in power. They will listen. Just keep on.
Yeah, that's right.
We're coming quite close to the end of this event, and we will move into some questions soon. And I've got to make sure I keep an eye on the document with the questions in it. Just quickly, and perhaps to lighten things up for the last few minutes, does anyone want to tell us about their worst culinary disaster, or maybe the worst meal they ever had to eat or share?
No.
Okay.
No, actually not. I actually, Deborah, if someone's putting food in front of you, you know, it's a joy, you know, that someone's trying to feed you. You know, I'd actually like to turn on its head. What's the best meal you've ever had? You know, because I think it's more important.
You can tell us about the best meal you've ever had, but do you reckon you can narrow it down?
The best meal I've ever had will be the best meal on the day, because what's good. A friend of mine who is an old publican from Albury, every time he sits down with a meal, someone puts a plate in front of him and he said, "Oh, that's the best steak I've ever had." And I reckon it's a way to live life. You know, just to think, be grateful for what's in front of you. You know, I'm in lockdown. I'm a writer. Almost 80% of my work's gone as a writer. Today, I'm late to our rehearsals today because I was working on a farm, because I'm now a farm worker, because I now have to put my kids through school by working on a farm. I'm grateful for everything that comes my way that's positive.
Ellen, have you got a favourite meal or dish?
I just want to echo Richard's talking about gratitude, because I think it's really important, and you know, it's an old cliche, any food that is cooked with love is always going to taste the best. I could name two things. I could my partner is a great cook. When we're together, she won't let me near the kitchen, and she's made me some soup that I'm going to have after this, and she said, you know, it's a quick dish, it's only going to, I'm just going to do something quick, but I know that it's going to be delicious. I really, if I can think of some best food memories, they revolve around ritual. I think there's something really special about food and ritual that I wanted to touch on. I love the physicality of shucking oysters, sitting by a fire with people and doing that, you know, physical thing. And, you know, it's sort of like the work of shucking an oyster, and, you know, it's such a little thing, but like it's sort of all, you know, with a little bit of lemon, you know, it's just perfect, you know. So just that ritual and comfort of doing that. So and being here on saltwater country, I had to mention the oysters.
And Donna, quickly, do you have a special meal or a memorable meal or that you want to comment on?
I agree that, you know, a meal if it's given to you and you're happy, that's a beautiful meal. But we live on a farm, so we actually have quite a big veggie garden. So my husband does most of the work in the garden and I do most of the cooking. So anything I can make, if he picks it and brings it in, I have to make it. And once you've grown it, you cannot waste it. So I'm making actually now a lovely radish leaf soup, which I've been using French recipes, which sounds very glamorous, but it's just a bit of butter and some radish leaves and potato and veggie stock. And it's astoundingly delicious for such simple ingredients. And when I think of all the radish leaves that I've thrown away in the past, you know, I just didn't actually realize that you could eat them. So
Donnie,
I think things that are...
No, I'm saying, Donnie,
yes, Richard.
You talk about the food that you and your husband have grown, and to me, that full cycle of earth, seed, plant, fruit, eating is so important. And talking to Ellen about gratitude, I think that I really miss at this time in lockdown, because I'm in Melbourne and I haven't seen my friends for a week, but I've been in hard lockdown because of the corona situation with
Yes.
I just want to reiterate to people, anyone listening, that the most important thing about food culture is the sharing. It's an every culture where we I look at some of the great billabongs around Melbourne, and they are some of the biggest places of corroborees for the Indigenous people. I look at my Christian culture in which I was brought up in, and we have at the very, very heart of that the Eucharist, which is based around breaking bread and drinking wine, together. And hello, cheers to everyone, and my friends in Dalesford are having a glass of wine there. To me, it's about being together, about putting everything aside and eating together, because when you're eating together, you're one with people, and that's I won't use the word communion because that sounds far too Christian, because that's behind me. But it's coming together to eat and to drink. And by the way, anyone is into food, look out for Max Allen's book, which is called Intoxicated, which is the 10 drinks that made Australia, which has a lot about Indigenous fermentation and a lot about Australian history with alcohol. Look out for it. It's an amazing book. I reckon it's going to be round about the way Dark Emu changed the way of thinking about Indigenous food. That'll be the way we change by thinking about alcohol in Australia. Eating and drinking together is so important, and I wish I could be with my friends tonight because we've got a big celebration going in our family that I can't be with my friends and family tonight. So I wish I was there. Sorry, Deborah.
Don't apologise. Thanks, Richard. I'm just looking at the questions and I'm looking at the time. So we've got a few questions here. One is, and I think this might be for you, Richard, a question from someone who's interested in considering the differences between food writing in creative writing. Well, maybe this is a question Donna might like to answer. The differences between food writing and creative writing and food writing in gastronomical texts. We can comment on that.
I think that's really, a fascinating question, that it could be seen as quite different, but it could be seen as very similar. I mean, I think creative writing and having food in novels and poetry and memoir could be seen as perhaps more personal, but then we've got very personal journalism and more cookbooks and everything are becoming more personal. So I think in line with a lot of genres today, while that might have been quite a strong division in the past, I think now all that sort of writing is blending up, and history and personal stories and meaning are in all those forms. So I don't think I would really see a firm division between them. I think maybe it's differently inflected with how it's presented. If you're thinking of a different audience, maybe a more gastronomic audience, you can say things without having to explain them a little bit more. But I do think that those sort of divisions are being elided much more as we move into the 21st century in writing.
The best writing is always contains detail, and when a writer gets detail correct, it is magnificent. Look at Proust's conversation around Lime Madeline. Look at the work of Joyce. Even Beckett brings in food into his writing. There's every time there's a great writer, you'll see a mention of food, because it actually nails a time, a place, but also a reaction from the audience. Irvine Welsh wrote a lot about drinking and eating in his Scottish work. You think of any great writer, they will always be passionate. I've just been reading Hemingway talking about putting wine into a cold stream in the near Pamplona when he was going fishing. That nailed the piece. Food writing occurs all the time in literature.
So the next question is a really good one, and most people don't consider cookbooks a sort of source of literary writing. So do the panelists have any recommendations for cookbooks where the writing about food is particularly compelling? And what instantly has sprung to my mind is Gay Bilson's book Plenty, which I've got up here somewhere behind me here. I had it as one of my props. That's a book I would recommend. Anyone else have any recommendations for books about where the writing about the food is really very compelling, what you might call literary?
Anything by Patience Gray. Patience Gray. Look at her work.
Donna?
And perhaps surprisingly, Nigella Lawson's first book. I mean, she has a wonderful sort of literary and historical background. And anything by Elizabeth David is just poetry to read.
I'll also punch in there, hate to say, but I also say Fleming's work, the Bond films, were always had a huge food and wine content to them. Look at the Martini in his work, and look at the way in the From Russia with Love. There was a great scene in that book where James Bond realizes that the bloke across the train, dining with him in the train carriage coming from Turkey back over to Europe, was actually a spy, because he ordered red wine with fish.
Oh, interesting. And I certainly learnt how to make a Vesper Martini from reading Casino Royale. So the next question here, Richard, is for you. It's from someone who's interested to hear about what food story interviews look like, how you approach, food story interviews.
Okay, soil, culture, technique, history, culture. And then I saw that comment before. Looking at the way people work together. If you're looking at someone, there's a ballet that when people cook, there's a ballet. The way that an actor will learn to use their body in a story in acting is the same way that a chef will learn to use their body when they cut something, when they mix something together. There is a somatosensory system learns how to use the body and remembers that. So there's a muscle memory. So to me, there's a ballet, an unspoken language of the body that comes from cooking. So when you see people cooking side by side, when you see the daughter and the mother cooking together, you'll see the daughter watch the mother. You'll see the son watch the father. You'll see the daughter and the father work together to understand how to work and how to understand that language of movement. And to me, there's a huge amount of information that comes from that you need to translate back into writing. You can't describe it necessarily, but that's what you have to watch out to. You need to use your eyes, your ears, your nose, your taste buds, and every single sense when you're writing, and that's what food writing is about.
Thank you. Here's another question where someone is wondering how many people have their mothers or their mother-in-law's handwritten recipe books. and they're handed down published cookbooks. So does anyone in the panel have a large collection or even a small collection of handwritten or handed down recipe books from their families?
My mother hated cooking, so no, but I have some from my husband's mum. Yeah, what were you going to say, Ellen?
Yeah, I have like collected some recipes from my mum, and when you asked me, Deborah, do you have a favorite recipe book, I thought it would be too naff to sort of say that it was more the book, you know, the book. I have a binder of recipes, but that is, you know, that's the most precious thing. I think that's the thing that you would run to get if there was a fire, I think.
So there's one more question here, and the person has asked if food is story and is about connection. What food are you missing most in this period of absence and social distance, if any?
Pho, Vietnamese pho.
Pho. You can't get it. You need to come and live near me, Richard. There's so much pho.
I really like a really good fresh pho that's been well cooked, and you can't get it. It dies in the back of a menu log van. So
you can't have pho.
I'm locked down. When I was working in Barcelona on cookbooks, the first place I'd go to, I'd hunt out a Vietnamese place because that is the food that I love, that makes me feel good.
Donna, anything you've obviously got your vegetable garden and providing all sorts of bountiful food. So is there anything you're particularly missing?
Because we're not going often into the shops, it's all that fresh fruit. I mean, we're very cold where I live in New South Wales at the moment, and we do have a little orchard, but of course nothing's now because it's winter. But I think that luxury of just popping in and buying, you know, a kilo of something that's beautiful and in season fruit, because that fresh fruit is not really quarantine-y type food. But really, no, not. I saw something flashed up on the chat. I think it was Alan. Somebody said the food he was missing was cooked by somebody else's, and I think we've mentioned that before. But I think it is that feeling of conviviality, because I was going to say go eat restaurant food, but it's not really the restaurant food. It's going to the restaurants with other people and having those conversations and fun.
And that comes back to the whole idea we've been talking about all night, is that food is about community and about connection and about story. And it's not really about the food, because I think I can identify with what you're saying, that there's nothing that I miss particularly. But what I miss is getting together with people, and I particularly miss being able to cook for people. So we are right on time. There's one last question, which is actually for me, which says, why is food prominent in my writing and how do I deploy it? I don't really have time to answer this question, except to say when I was growing up, food in Australia was pretty grim. And I think in my writing, I've been trying to undo the horrors of my childhood eating experiences. So we've just gone over time. So I think now I need to wrap this up and obviously say a huge thank you to Donna, to Ellen and to Richard. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your contributions. Thanks for all the wonderful ideas. And thanks for making me hang out for my dinner, which has been cooked by someone else and is waiting for me when I leave my study. And can I just ask everyone who's been attending to put their microphones back on and to give our panellists, Donna, Ellen and Richard, a huge clap of applause. Thank you.